Hey, how do you feel about some high rarity cards, or maybe some foreign ones, or maybe be ahead of the game with others by preparing for future set releases with very quick shipping? Check out EJ Gaming and use code British5 on checkout for 5% off on all your orders. Link in the description.
Greetings duelists and welcome to another video. So on one of the last videos that I did was regarding like a lot of like theory crafting when it comes to like picking decks and the issue with deck diversity in Age of Overlord. I pretty much tried to showcase like one of the decks that like I used as a prime example, which was Virtual World, and I received a bunch of comments like asking me for the list and like asking me about my takes when it comes to like Virtual World in general, like as a whole, involving like either this format or like with the release of Agent for Overlord. And I kind of wanted to share like a few things before I shared the deck. So why am I showcasing Virtual World, or why did I use Virtual World as an example in the first place? So the prime reason is because of how strong QB Virtual World Chenshin is, and like the application that it has like with the current decks in the format. If we look at the particular decks that we're going to face, or like strategies that are going to be new with Age of Overlord, I saw like there were a plethora of cards that just fold to like the existence of Chen being on the board. One example of this is the Diabellstar, the Dark Witch, with the Sinful Spoils engine. Another example would be like the Snake Eye archetype. Like another example would be tier elements and like new tier element variants. Horus is another risky one, because if even though the Horus monsters trigger upon cards being removed, if you start removing them from the board and like they get banished, they cannot come back from the graveyard. So to some extent Horus also suffers from this. So there's a couple of things in this format that are just going to be seeing a lot of play. They just can't deal with the existence of Chinchin. Other examples would be like the new Labyrinth support, the new Manadium support, like all those plethora of things. The Visas like universe as a whole cannot deal with Chinchin very efficiently. So that was like one of the big reasons I took when it comes to Virtual World. The second reason is because of the Armor XYZ package. I feel like any deck or any engine in the game that can play these cards are going to just greatly benefit from them, because this is an engine that just gives you a lot of pluses. And not only do they give you a lot of pluses, but it also synergizes perfectly with the Virtual World deck, because in the Armored XYZ combo, you end up with this card in your hand twice, plus one draw. And you have two cards already that are from the Virtual World archetype that just moves cards out of your hand into the graveyard. Meaning that with the synergy with the XYZ armor package, these cards essentially just becomes like free like cards that resolve under those conditions. Like that's pretty much like the two main things that it came to like Virtual World. Here's my deck list. I'm still experimenting with a few things. This is not like really set in stone. There's a lot of things you can do with this deck, but I guess I'll explain ratios as we go along. The virtual world ratios are pretty much standard. If you played Virtual World in the past, you already know that this is a 2 of 3, 3, 3, and 3. The reason you max out on all the names, except for Nian Nian, is because you always want to open with multiple Virtual Worlds in hand. It's not the same as like other decks where you just want to see like one. In this particular deck, you want to see multiples. This deck is pretty much similar to Unchained in that regard, where you just want multitude of cards that just work with each other. So we're playing Speedroid Terratop. Terratop is really strong because again it can make you the X Armor XYZ. Anything that can make you Armor XYZ in this deck is welcomed. But in Virtual World specifically, it's still even more so because Tacticonborg is not actually a brick, it's actually an extender. Because you have Lulu and you have Nian Nian as your wind monsters that can just work alongside the Tacticonborg. So our hand traps of choice are Ash and Imperm. Ash is there because it's a level 3 tuner, and like out of every hand trap that we have in the game, this is like the more adaptable one. This one like pretty much plays well into any given format, so it's just the safest one to pick. Imperm, like this is not as impactful as other hand traps that we have. However, this card does not lose to triple tactic talents. If you notice, Ash Blossom is literally the only monster hand trap that we have in the main deck, meaning that you don't have to worry about talents for the most part. And Imperm is just one of those cards that help with that. Another thing about Imperm is just it helps you like going second when you're trying to contest through boards as well. It's a card that you can use alongside with Chen Chen and you don't have to worry about. But yeah, it's also a card that you can set to activate Ultimaya Sulkin, and that also does come up. I think Talents is really, really strong in like a deck like this one, especially because this deck is not the easiest deck to hand trap. Like outside of Ash Blossom and maybe Ghost Bell, which is not super common in the format, and like one or two other cards, this deck is pretty much does not lose too many hand traps. Like Valor and Imperm actually don't do anything to you. Like it deals with the Armor XYZ package, but like outside of that, it does not stop your actual virtual world plays, which is something very, very interesting and important and ideal. So the last time virtual world was like super relevant, and we're not gonna count YCS Dormant because it did top the last YCS. Emergency teleport was not a 3, and now that the deck has 3 emergency teleport, it still has consistency issues. However, those consistency issues are more mitigated now, and you have a lot more windows for your opening plays to resolve in this deck. We do not play Prosperity in this deck because you are playing the Armor XYZ package. I feel like this package is just way too strong to like circumvent a card like Pot. Like you're drawing out of Torpedo as a +1, and drawing in this deck is really strong because like again this is like a 2-card combo deck and you have a bunch of cards to just kickstart your combo. We are playing Pot of Desires. It's pretty much like another +1. You don't outside of like the full armored XYZ, you are not worried about a lot of cards that you might lose with that Desires. This deck is really, really strong at like securing board presence. However, you do lose a bunch of hand advantage when you're resolving a lot of your virtual world plays. So just having a card that guarantees you a +1 is just really, really strong. It can be a contingency problem because you can lose some of the virtual world cards, but you're playing so many of them that this card is just perfectly fine with it. The side deck is kind of experimental, you don't have to think about it, but I will talk about droplets for a second. Another really strong thing about virtual world is that with the existence of QB Chen Chen, droplets is a way harder card to resolve against this deck than against other decks that has negation like built into them. And that's very, very important because I feel like this card is going to be very, very popular. I think it's going to be like one of the more important board breaking cards in the format, and just having a deck that really doesn't lose to it is really, really strong. Another really cool thing about this deck is you can play Beatrice. This is like one of the easier decks that can summon Beatrice. The other one being Tear Element to some extent. And that's really, really cool because it means that you can play stuff like Necro World Banshee and just like freeze Floowandereeze or freeze Unchained or freeze Recast on Avalon, just to name like a few decks. You can also like play other cards. You can even play the Ichizu cards in this deck. Like you can play the Ichizu cards in this deck and just like use them as like cards that you can just dump with Beatrice just to like stop your opponent. So that's like another really good example of stuff that you can play here. Skill Drain is also really strong in this deck. Like that guy from YCS Tournament played Skill Drain in his main deck. You can play this instead of Imperm. It's really not an incorrect choice if you want to play this. But in this deck, this card is really strong. Like most of your virtual world plays are not hindered by Skill Drain at all. So just having Skill Drain like resolve like against your opponent is strong. Another really cool thing about Skill Drain in this deck is that the Armor XYZ package, once you resolve everything, the only thing that Skill Drain stops is the full armor Dark Lancer. Like the XYZ equips still have their effects, and the full armored XYZ also gives them extra attack, and that's the effect of full armored XYZ and not from the monsters themselves. So you can make the argument that Skill Drain just could be just better than Imperm, but just that's another thing to like think about when like deck building this deck. So let's cover the extra deck real quick. We already talked about the Armor XYZ cards. I already made a video on them as well. I think this package is really strong. If your deck can play it, like you really have a respectable deck, because these are just like this engine is a +2 that can essentially become a +3. And not only is it a +3, but it's non-targeting removal on your opponent's turn, plus protection for your monsters. Like, yeah, I really highly recommend you playing this package if you're playing Virtual World. Wallow. So this card is really strong, especially against tier elements. Like, if you play against tier elements and you summon this card and you have a bunch of monsters, you might just outright just win the duel. Like this card pretty much like wins you the game, because all the monsters you control are just gaining a bunch of attack for each card in your opponent's graveyard. Like, and in a deck like tier elements, like your opponents gonna have like 10-20 cards in the graveyard. So imagine each of your monsters just having 2,000 plus attack. Another really cool thing about this card is that it can just drag monsters from your opponent's graveyard and summon it to your side, and you can do a bunch of things with them. Like one example is, let's say you're facing against Unchained, they have like a Chiyama. You can just bring it back to your side, use that Chiyama's effect, and after that you can just rank it up into another rank 6 or Synchro 9 with it, just because it's level 6 and it's synergized with this deck. You can bring back like Bestials and do the same thing. You can like bring back like other really problematic monsters like Baron the Floor, like just to give some examples. You can just set cards to your side of the field as well. It doesn't have to set it doesn't have to special summon a monster. It can also set any card. Like that's really strong. You can set field spells. You can set spell and traps, like stuff that you know that can just hurt your opponent. It's really strong with this card. So another really high recommendation if you're playing Virtual World. At first I was playing M7 instead of Fan. However, I feel like after testing this deck, Ptolemy M7 just didn't come up. Like, grabbing cards from your graveyard is not really that important. Like, you already have GG that can do that, and if you like cycle through your combo cards, you might have in a scenario where you just end up with multiple Quinglongs in graveyard, so you have them for next turn. You're getting so much card advantage if you just recycle your full armor XYZ package. So like that's really strong there as well. So I just felt M7 was not needed. I felt like Fan is a really strong card. The main selling point of Fan is that it floats if it gets destroyed. So if your opponent tries to get rid of it, you can just summon 2 virtual world monsters and just keep playing. It's also a virtual world name, so you can just keep playing with your virtual world names or like other names that you have to follow up if you just like try to summon this card and use them alongside it. But yeah, like I highly recommend it. So I'm playing Long Long. So Long Long could be Jaja. However, I wanted a rank 3 virtual world name, and I felt Long Long was a really good one because if you again face a deck like Tear Elements, for example, and let's say your opponent tries to activate a Tear effect and they don't have a dark monster on the board, you can just use Long Long's effect and just negate it. Like if you're facing like other cards, like if, for example, your opponent tries to use these Chizu cards on you and they don't control the Chizu cards, this card's really good. If your opponent is playing Unchained, like for example, they're trying to activate Shiyama and they don't have a water monster on the board, Long Long is really good on that regard as well. If your opponent tries to float with an Unchained monster and they don't control like the correct attribute, you can just negate that as well. Like there's a lot of scenarios where this card just comes up that like are kind of obscure, but now more so in this current format are just less obscure. So yeah, this can be Jaja. Jaja is also really good because it is non-targeting removal and banish. Like if you're going second, but I just chose Long Long for like this exploration. I already covered Dark Lancer. I'll cover Team Doomsday Star or Stellar Crisis, I think it's now called. After I cover the rest of XYZs. Evil Sword Lars. This was played for by the guy who topped in Dortmund. I feel like this is a really good card. It's pretty much like a hot red Dragon Archfiend. It can just negate any card that's activating that's currently on the board. So if you have good enough disruptions against your opponent, this card is really good. Evenly Matched is a card you don't have a lot of defense against, so this card is really strong against that, like specifically. Another really cool thing is if your opponent tries to like Dark Ruin or more, like your current board, and you have this alongside Chushe, you can, well, actually, no, you can't because it says when your opponent activates, so it will miss timing if you try to do that. It doesn't work exactly the hot red. However, yeah, outside of Dark Ruler, I think this card is strong, like against a lot of cards, and I think like warrants a deck spot, like if you do have the spot for it. Zeus is self-explanatory. I don't have to explain Zeus in a virtual world deck. I will talk about Stellar Nemesis. So Stellar Nemesis is really cool in this deck because with the full armor XYZ package, Stellar Nemesis can become a monster that not only stops your opponent's really big monsters on the board, but if you resolve like the full armor combo, or you have like full armor cards already in your graveyard and you summon Doomsday Star, you can just activate the full armor XYZ, banish it from the graveyard, like use the torpedo, equip it to Doomsday, and now you have a walking floodgate for high level monsters that cannot be targeted or blown up. And that's really strong. Like I feel like that's like one of the only decks that can do that. Also, the virtual world restrictions does not restrict you to summon Doomsday Star. So that's another really big bonus. But yeah, that's it for XYZs. Synchros, you have Coral Dragon, you have Charge Warrior. Those are just like stepping stone level 6 monsters. You already know how those work. Juju is a virtual name, and it's actually really good. Like Unchained has a really hard time dealing with this monster. Like, like outside of using Anguish, they really don't have a way to deal with this card. Um, like you cannot destroy it. So like against the Unchained deck, like specifically, this card is really strong. It also sends cards to the graveyard, so it doesn't trigger your opponent's Unchained cards if you use that effect. Sulking, Crystal Wing. So this is one of the only ways to stop Nibiru if you're trying to play around that. It's also just really strong boss monster in general. Like it just punishes your opponent really really hard. It's a really strong card in part of your end board. So the last card is Chen. We already talked about this. Like this is the whole reason you play the deck in the first place. I think Chen is just really really strong this format. So like if you are a budget player, you can't like afford the Diabellstar package, you can't afford like playing for like Vanadium or like Labyrinth or like other supporting themes, or you can't afford like the Horus cards, I feel Virtual World is a really 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 good pick. Like these cards are cheap. They're not worth a lot. Like the most expensive card here could be like maybe Raz, like maybe the Evil Sword, and maybe the Stellar Nemesis. And everything else is pretty much budget. I don't think the Armor XYZ cards are gonna be worth anything. So yeah, I hope you found this video informative. I hope you found this deck like to your liking. Uh, keep practicing and keep dueling.